So now I want to talk a little bit about the literary forms of the prophet's vocation story. And the prophet's vocation story is basically an origin story. And you can think of, the superheroes. Batman's parents are shot in front of him in a dark alley. And so, as across these different superheroes, some common characteristics of the origin story arise, and the same is true within the prophet's vocation story. So that gives us these four different literary forms, these four different models or schemas of how prophets are called and what that looks like and how that plays out. Before we talk about those four forms, though, it's important to note that these vocation stories, much like many of the prophets' prophecies, are not necessarily word-for-word accounts of what actually happens. And I say this not to kind of say that these aren't important because they didn't happen, but because the prophets are having an experience of the divine, of God, who is ultimately unknowable. Human language is completely inadequate to describing God. We can say some things, but it's impossible to completely cover everything that we would like to. So when the prophets have these experiences, whether that's their vocation story or later revelations, they need to adapt these to human language, to human communication. And these are also deeply personal experiences that they're trying to communicate in a language that's ultimately going to be unsuitable to that task. So these origin stories aren't necessarily exactly what happens, but the purpose that they're communicating is very real and is in no way lessened, because it didn't happen word for word, one to one, as we read in the Bible. And that's important because the origin story, the vocation story of the prophet, it's not necessarily the event that came first chronologically, but is rather the orientating story. It gives the purpose and the sense of their mission and what they're being sent to accomplish. And like I said, there are generally four patterns that happen across the different prophets and their calling. There's the military schema. And you can think of this as like a general giving orders to his soldiers. God says go, and the prophet goes. This could be seen in Abraham, for example. God says, go to this land over here that I'll show you, and Abraham goes. We can see this also with Jonah. God says, go to Nineveh, and he goes. He takes a little detour at first. He has to take a little rest in the belly of the whale. But in the end, he does go. Then there's the diplomatic schema. You can think of this as like a king sending an ambassador to another king. And there's usually some objections to this on the part of the prophet. The best example of this is Moses. God sends Moses to Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt. And Moses objects at first, saying he's not a very good speaker. And then there's the political schema. This is the prophet Isaiah, and we'll actually read through this vocation story in the next video, and I'll point out some things. But this is where the prophet is invited into the royal court of God. And he is invited into the circle of advisors and is invited to intervene directly with the king, even without an invitation, before even being invited to do so. So this is a pretty important one. And then finally, there's the pedagogical schema, and this is a gradual understanding of the call that happens over time. And if you think of the story of Samuel, he's as a younger guy. He was asleep, and God calls him 3 times during the night. The first 2 times, he can't figure out what's going on. And it's only on the 3rd time that he's finally able to understand what's going on and to answer the call.